Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this second session of the 11th Annual Refugee Law Initiative Seminar Series, run in partnership this year with the Platform on Disaster Displacement, PDD. Today's seminar addresses the theme of data and knowledge on human mobility in the context of natural hazards. And as RLI Director, I'm really delighted to introduce the moderator for today's session, Atle Solberg, the head of the PDD Secretariat. Over to you, Atle.
Thank you very much, David, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, PDD, I just wanted to reiterate that we're very excited to partner with you, David, and the Refugee Law Initiative in this seminar series and in this webinar session. Also, thanks a lot for trusting us to moderate this second webinar session of the 11th Annual RLI Seminar on Human Mobility, Natural Hazards, and Policy Responses. Assuming that we have some new participants joining us today compared to those that joined us in the first session, I just wanted to recap a little what we talked about in the first webinar session on the 7th of October. We heard from you, David, that the choice of this topic of this year reflects growing interest in how environmental processes and natural hazards shape human mobility, including displacement, migration, and planned relocation. Natural hazards that shape human mobility include slow onset impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, as well as sudden onset disasters linked to the hazards like storms, earthquakes, and even biological hazards like the COVID-19 pandemic. As you understand, our topic is then situated very squarely within global debates on climate change, global debates on migration, displacement, refugees, disaster risk reduction, and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. A key question that we pose in the seminar series is how can law and policy engage with the impact of such natural hazards on human mobility. Each of the 6 webinar sessions in the series approaches this question from a distinct angle, as you can see from the seminar series program, which is available in full on the RLI and the PDD website. The first seminar on the 7th of October covered some conceptual and theoretical grounds. We heard from 4 great speakers and experts that discussed whether concepts such as disaster displacement, climate refugees, environmental migrants can help us to frame and understand the topic, and whether they help us to drive better understanding, better research, evident analysis, and policies. I had 4 quick takeaways from the first session, which I think is relevant to recall for the discussion today. First of all, we heard about different approaches to conceptualize disaster displacement. There's different ways of entering an understanding of the phenomenon. A second takeaway is that there are different forms. There's a variety of forms of human mobility that can be linked to the adverse effect of climate change and loss and damage. The third issue is that we should be careful about some of our terms and how we speak about these issues can drive a negative or a false narrative and lead to bad policies. And the fourth issue I think we took away from the first session is that we shall recognize that this is a complex field and that these issues are fundamentally political and social, and there are also limited use of having binary and simplified understanding of it. Moving on to the seminar today, we will build on that discussion we had on the 7th of October, and we will be hearing from 4 leading researchers and experts on data and knowledge on human mobility in the context of natural hazards. It's a great opportunity to hear about state-of-the-art and empirical evidence around diverse forms of human mobility and immobility in the context of environmental challenges, including empirical challenges, data and trends, and projections for the future. Each speaker today will have about 8 to 10 minutes to present, and we will be quite tough on time management. Given the tight time frame, I will also only briefly introduce each speaker, but their full biographies can be seen online following the link that appears now in that you bring up on the side of your screen. During the presentation, I would like to ask you that you pose your questions by typing them into the chat box. I will then select a few questions that we will then put to the presenters after they have presented. Finally, I would like all participants to keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you are speaking as a presenter. Please also note that we will be recording this session, the podcast of which will be available next week on the RLI and PDD website. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Justin Ginnetti, who is currently an independent consultant. Justin, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, David and Atle, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you here. It's a really pleasure to be with you and to see so many familiar faces. Many of you may know me from my previous capacity as the former head of data and analysis at IDMC, but today I'll be speaking in my own personal capacity, though I will be drawing upon much of the work done at IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Arfin, if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, great, thanks. I think one of the first things that we want to bear in mind when we think about displacement as a result of natural hazards is that since about 2008, when this phenomenon began to be systematically monitored around the world, disasters have forced more people to flee their homes than by conflict, almost 3 times as many per year on average, totaling about 288 million disaster displacements since 2008. These movements take several different forms, from preemptive evacuations to post-disaster rescues, from short-term evacuation, from permanent displacement, and even migration. For most disasters and most disaster displacement, the data is collected only during the short initial phase, the emergency phase following the disaster, and we lose track of these people over time and what happens to them. If we go to the next slide, please. We see here that in 2019, alone, disasters displaced people in 140 countries around the world. This is about an average year, so to speak. Most of the disaster displacement, as you can see in the map, is concentrated in South and Southeast Asia, which is again typical for a given year of disaster displacement. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just one back, thanks. What we were seeing there, these are the reported incidents of disaster displacement in 2019 alone. At IDMC, there were about 2,000 discrete events that were captured and used and referenced in its global figures and the global report on internal displacement. However, we should take note of the fact that this alone is still a small fraction of the total amount of disaster displacement occurring around the world. In the United States alone, for example, the Red Cross responds to upward of 50 to 60,000 events of disaster displacement per year. Okay, next slide. What we know about disaster displacement is that it's very much driven by exposure of people in their homes to natural hazards. So where you see the darkest shading there in red, which is the highest amounts of population exposure to natural hazards, also correlates quite closely with where we see the most disaster displacement. And this will come back in some of the later slides and points I'll make in a few moments. If we go to the next slide, please. What we see here is that weather-related hazards cause far more displacement than geophysical hazards. Almost 90% of all disaster displacements recorded since 2008 have been associated with hydrometeorological hazards, primarily floods and storms. Next slide, please. And lastly, we know roughly when and where disaster displacement will occur, not so much in a given point in time, on a given day or hour in a given location, but due to the seasonality of weather-related hazards. We know quite well when and where these generally take place over the course of a year, which you can see in this slide here. We see that storm-related displacement tends to happen in the latter half of the year, in particular during the hurricane season in the North Atlantic and during the cyclone season in the Pacific. And floods tend to happen most in the monsoon season, or most flood-related displacement happens during the monsoon season in South Asia. If we go to the next slide there, thanks. And then here you can see in even more granular detail how this breaks down by region and by month. And this is something that we know from the historical data as well as from models of disaster displacement risk. Now, a little bit on what we know less of and what we don't know as well. Displacement caused by slow onset hazards is much less well reported on and known, and the data is a bit more scarce and uncertain. And this is largely, but not exclusively, due to the fact that disaster displacement arising in the context of slow onset hazards is also influenced by many other factors as well. And it's associated with many other phenomena of relevance, such as food insecurity or loss of livelihoods. So when people are receiving assistance, sometimes they report on themselves as having been displaced. Sometimes they report to data collectors that they're simply food insecure, and then we have to disambiguate what that actually means in real life. The next slide, please. One thing we know a little bit less of is how much future disaster displacement risk will increase in the future. We know that due to the impacts of climate change, as well as demography and human development, that disaster displacement risk will increase over the coming decades. But depending upon which pathway we choose, both with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as how we develop as societies, we don't exactly know how much it will increase. And therefore, we should therefore be suspicious of any kind of point prediction of how many people are likely to be displaced in the future as a result of climate change, because again, that number is not a fixed point, but it's all we can say is that there's a range about basically between two or multiple different scenarios, depending upon how we organize ourselves as a society over the coming decades. Next. And lastly, one of the things that we don't know quite so much about is for how long people remain displaced. This is again due to the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that most data on disaster displacement comes during the early stages or early days following a disaster or the occurrence of a natural hazard, and we lose track of people over time. But what we do know is as of the end of last year, there were approximately 5.1 million people who remained in displacement at the year's end as a result of disasters that occurred either during that year or during previous years. But this is a significant underestimate, and it doesn't account for many people for whom we simply lost track of due to lack of observational data. And then my last slide, I believe, or last substantive slide, is something that I think Kanta will speak to in a moment, and I'm glad to see Alex Deshurbinen also with us today. But it's this combination or the nexus of disaster displacement and migration. The tipping points between when a displacement that may initially be a short-term movement turns over into a permanent migration or permanent change of location for someone. When and why this comes about is something that is still a work in progress, and we need to do more research on this phenomenon and evolve the current modeling that exists to better answer these questions. And that's it for me. I think we'll be taking the questions in the chat, but I look forward to hearing now from the other presenters. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Justin. That was great, covering a relatively complex field and some clear messages. I think what is interesting that you indicate there are certain predictability of where and when there will be risk. We can estimate these places and these times due to the weather-related nature of it, but also caution against projections and knowing much about the future, because it's really multi-causal. I also think the last comment you had on that tipping point when mobility turns more forced or when you have inhabitability. I think that's an issue that we will come back to. So that was great, and thank you so much for keeping the time. You will have an opportunity to come back and answer question when the other speakers have spoken. So thank you, Justin. And then very pleased to introduce our second speaker, Caroline Zickgraf from the Hugo Observatory. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. And thank you to both the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the Refugee Law Initiative. If I could ask Afrin to share my slides, please. Well, let me get started while we wait for the slides. But what I wanted to do today is really to present to you the beginning framework of a big project that we've just launched. We're coordinating at the University of Liège called the Habitable Project. Habitable is focused on looking at, as was just mentioned briefly in a slightly different way, but social tipping points, identifying and linking climate change, habitability, and social tipping points. If you could switch to the next slide, please. So Habitable gathers 21 partners from 18 countries around the world to look at climate and migration issues, as well as displacement, in a series of, using a series of methods and looking at various countries of the world to try to have a better understanding and advance our knowledge and data on issues linked to human mobility, again, disaster and migration, and climate change. Next slide, please. So within Habitable, we have kind of 4 broad domains as well as objectives. So the first thing that we want to look at is causality. So trying to understand, of course, why migration happens, why displacement happens, and the kind of multi-causality of that, of course. So that's something we know well from evidence that it's never just climate change, it's never just environmental factors. It tends to be some sort of mix of social, political, economic, environmental, and demographic factors that lead to migration. So that's our first broad domain that we're looking at, and we specifically have looked at are looking at social tipping points within that domain. But we're also trying to understand more than just causality, right? We want to look beyond causality to some of the issues that Justin's raised, for example, temporal and geographical scales of movement, and also adaptation. So this is a rising discourse that's emerged probably over the past 10 years. So I'm not sure if we can call it emerging anymore, but that migration is not just the failure to adapt. Migration is also an adaptation strategy in itself, but it's one of many available to some households and families and individuals, but not necessarily to all. So we also want to look at adaptation strategies and migration amongst adaptation, but also the impacts of movement on people's adaptive capacities, and also feeding back into causality, how movement of some people can encourage, facilitate migration for others, or enable immobility. And the third objective that I think we're particularly proud of as well is that we're really trying to take a gender and social inequity approach to this. So we're not kind of putting gender to the side or ticking that box, but rather really mainstreaming it into our research and trying to understand social inequity and gender. And that part will be led by, I believe, our colleagues on the line, this SEI from Bangkok and Sarah Vigil. And then lastly, again, because all of these things are connected, is policy. Trying to come up with policy recommendations, but also co-producing scenarios in the future with policymakers and with key stakeholders, so that this isn't something that we plan to just hand off in year 2024 and say, this is what you should do, but rather work with policymakers to better understand their challenges, to better understand how they react to certain situations, what their abilities are, and where we might further assist them to make sure we're having comprehensive policy approaches. Next slide, please. So driving our data collection, again, across a series of methods, from longitudinal surveys, different kinds of modeling, qualitative techniques, focus groups, scenario building, fuzzy cognitive mapping, which is kind of a semi-quantitative technique. These are kind of the key concepts that we're looking at. So one, of course, is habitability. And we call it habitable because we're not very creative, perhaps. But We want to understand habitability from a different way that's been commonly spoken of. So a lot of times we hear that migration happens or will happen, or displacement will happen because land becomes uninhabitable, that there will be sea level rise or heat stress to such a point that it's physically uninhabitable space for people, and that leads to movement. However, we take it from a kind of a different starting point, that habitability is much more than a physical determination. So movement is not just a signifier that land or places become uninhabitable, it's also a social determination. So it's also about livelihoods, for example. One of the main connections between climate change and particularly slow onset events is the impacts on livelihoods. And so that economic component, but also many other factors again. So seeing this multi-causality means that you also have to approach the idea of habitability, not just from a physical standpoint and looking at climate parameters, but seeing it as a social space and a social system. And so we use habitability to approach socio-ecological systems. We see again, for example, something like migration as adaptation as amongst a series of adaptation strategies, and not everyone will employ them. Everyone has the same adaptation options available. And so we look at these coupled socio-ecological systems. So not just a climate system, but trying to see everything as it takes place in a broader system in which migration systems connect different socio-ecological systems, for example, between a place of origin and a destination, but also migration systems or subsystems within a broader socio-ecological system. And this, we believe, helps us to steer away as well from more deterministic approaches. So where we say that, for example, one place will be uninhabitable physically, and therefore migration happens, or a place is vulnerable to climate change, therefore we can just count all of those people as future displaced people. We see that this is quite linear, and what we know from all the evidence is that actually the relationship is quite nonlinear. And so this is something that's been mentioned in passing, but immobility, right? So it's not just that people leave, not everyone leaves, of course, everyone is vulnerable in the same ways from one household to another or from one individual to another. But we have to see some of these non-linearities not as outliers, but actually as integral to our understandings of the climate and mobility relationship and nexus. So again, relating to our perception or our perspective that habitability is a social determination as much as it is a physical one, we're trying to identify social tipping points. So social tipping points, we're going to have work that's led by colleagues, I believe, are also on the call, University of Exeter. But the idea is that we often talk about climate tipping points, which is really useful from a climate science perspective, but maybe not quite as useful from a perspective of those looking at more social impacts of climate change. So we have to use those climate tipping points when, even a tiny perturbation can cause a system, and here for us, a socio-ecological system, to change states. But then also we have to look at social tipping points and understand that social tipping points can be reached before climate tipping points. So social tipping points, moving, for example, from a place of habitability or a state of habitability to one of uninhabitability, that might be migration or displacement might be a symptom of that, whether at the community level, whether at the household level, or at the individual level, which is something we're trying to understand all of these levels as they interact as well. And so, for example, the idea again that we're reaching a climate tipping point means migration might happen. We might be really blind to what actually might happen, which is that social tipping points can be reached well before a climatic tipping point. So again, through mechanisms such as livelihoods and economic pathways. So we're trying to identify these social tipping points, again, for at different scales at which migration or displacement occurs, and try to understand that not from the perspective of the external observer, again, from externally observed climate data alone, but from the perspective of populations. So again, we're using longitudinal surveys and as well as in-depth qualitative techniques to try to identify these social tipping points. And again, looking from a perceptions focus. So perceptions for us of the local populations or affected populations are extremely vital to all of this work. So we have an entire kind of work package that's dedicated to that. And so looking at people, how they perceive risk. So we know from previous work and ongoing work that people don't always, they're not necessarily tapped into every climate data and rainfall station around them, but their perception of risk is what they base their migration or displacement decisions upon. And so that's where we need to start, is looking at how they perceive the risk, environmental change, as well as, is mobility considered an adaptive response? Is that a failure to adapt? And start from their point of view, rather than, again, some external perspective on that. Last slide. So with that, thank you very much. And I hope to be able to answer some questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Caroline. That was great. And I think everyone in this field, we are very excited about this project. I think you can really help us to move on certain conceptual issues and also directly policy relevant, as adaptation is becoming one of the key discussion items under the Climate Change Convention. I think the mobility link would be very useful also from a policy perspective. So I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of people, very excited about this project, and we will follow it closely and hope we can touch base with you regularly on this. I just want to remind everyone, all the participants, we have now had 2 speakers, and we will take all the question towards the end of the session, or the end of the 4 speakers. So please post your questions in the chat box. We will try to systematize them, and then we will post to the presenter. So if you have questions for Justin or Caroline, please put them in the chat box, and then we will have an opportunity to talk about those after the next 2 speakers. So with that, thank you so much, Caroline. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Kanta Kumari Rigaud from the World Bank. Kanta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Atle, and requesting our friend to put up the slides. So first of all, thank you to RLI and PDD for this invitation. And I think it's good to follow 2 presentations that have been very clear in looking at the complexity of movement under climate change. What I'll share with you is an approach that we worked with at the World Bank together with leading researchers, the Columbia University, CUNY Institute of Demographic Research, and the Potsdam Institution, to develop a sort of a model approach to understanding the future of climate-induced migration. Next slide, please. And what we really looked at is really the context, right? So I think what we've heard from the previous speakers is that climate change and sort of weather and natural hazards are definitely increasing the scale of displacement and mobility. And what we were interested to understand is looking further ahead. How can, in the face of increasing climate change and impacts, how can we help to understand the issue and help policymakers better plan and prepare for what we call climate-induced migration, recognizing it's of course driven by multiple factors. But we were interested to understand what was the potency of climate in driving some of these spatial shifts in populations. So what the Groundswell report did was really use a scenario-based approach, which was really grounded in what we call the population gravity model, which really looks at localities in terms of their attraction, either in terms of push and pull factors that could change the future population distributions. And we try to model this and bring in the slow onset climate factors. And these are particularly important because they lead to some of the protracted changes that may lead to those population shifts. Definitely, as we are using global data sets, there are sources of uncertainty both in the models itself as well as some of the interplay. But I think what we tried to do was to be very explicit on what those uncertainty sources are. And I think one important thing that the model did, the approach did, was ground this not just in sort of relating them to climate change in terms of temperature and precipitation, but brought it back down to looking at the crop and water simulation models. And why is this important? Because this is really where drops in crop productivity directly impact livelihoods, as well as water stresses can affect the way livelihoods play out. And that really links to the development outcome. So the idea here was to go beyond that. If you can go back to the previous slide. Then we also brought in sea level, which was complemented by some surge. But what was really important, even as we did this aggregate level modeling, was contextualizing back those scenarios into the narratives that we had. And we particularly used some case studies to draw out the narrative and ground it in the reality of what was happening, both in the historical and current sense, to make sure that these plausible livelihoods were grounded in that context. Next slide, please. So in the scenario-based approach, we drew, as I said, on globally available data sets so that they were coherent and could be compared across. But we started up with what we call the pessimistic reference scenario, which assumes continued high emissions and an unequal development pathway. And to this, if you can just press the slides, just keep pressing 3 or 4 times, Afrin. What we did is brought in the data sets, and this was modeled at the level of a grid cell of 14 kilometers. And what we did here was look at a scenario that didn't have any of these climate factors built in, and then we wanted with the climate to draw out what was the climate and no impact, no climate impact, so that we could see the shifts in spatial population distribution. Next click, please. And then the results were produced and aggregated up at the national and up to the sort of continental level. Because next slide, our real intent was to understand the scale of the issue moving ahead. And the idea here is really to understand that, you know, we know that climate is changing, we know the impacts of it are increasing, and we can see those displacements and mobility, but how do we understand it going further? So we found that at least for the 3 regions that we studied, the scale was in the tune of 143 million under the worst case scenario. And these are plausible scenarios, they're not cast in stone, but they do also show that the alternative, inclusive and climate friendly scenarios, which when you bring in the adaptation and inclusive development, will really allow that, that kind of adverse impact to be moderated or modulated. And what we see in the graphic at the bottom is that we really have a window of opportunity, because these kind of impacts are likely going to escalate, and the trajectory for them is ramping up. So we have a real window of opportunity to take action, both in terms of the greenhouse gas, which we really should reduce, but also on the adaptation and inclusive actions that Caroline referred to. But I think one other value of this approach was the spatial nature, because of the geospatial aspects of this model, which allows us to see what could be some of those emerging hotspots of both climate in and out migration. Now, one may argue that these are not so solid, but I think what we also try to do is ground it back in the evidence and understand what is happening. And what you do realize is that none of these hotspots are being sort of coming from a top down. They have a lot of contextualization that we've tried to do, and you begin to see the signs and signals that some of these areas do have some distress signals, and how we really manage going forward is important. But next slide. But recognize that this is a top-down model to set the scale. But what we've done since we released the Groundswell report was brought certain enhancements to this model to make them sort of more relevant at a very local level. I won't go through all of the changes, but except to say that we took a few steps, and Alex Sherbinin is here who can also speak to this. We brought in some additional dimensions. We talked about crops and water and sea level rise, but we also now added in, based on the ISIMIT model, the state-of-the-art crop simulation, but they have also ecosystem simulation models that we've added in. We've added in a 4th scenario, which is the optimistic, which is assuming we meet our Paris targets and assuming we have good inclusive development. What would that mean in terms of managing some of this distress-driven migration? We brought in smaller timescales and modeled it at a higher resolution, with the idea to have really more informed decision-making processes, again, grounding this back in the reality of what's happening. Next slide, please. But these models, as I said, the inputs to them, besides the sort of big data sets, is also the calibration of the model backwards. So we did calibrate it from 1990 to 2000 to 2010 to really pick up that climate signal before we projected it forward, as well as come up with those coefficients then that feed into the model. So this is really a highly involved process to sort of say that those numbers are grounded back in some of the best state-of-the-art data that we have, but recognizing it's plausible models. Next slide. So when you sort of begin to look also in the context of countries, which we are doing using this enhanced model, they do give us similar metrics that we've used before, but much more grounded data. And this is just a schematic of what the results coming out from Kenya. And what we're doing now is really contextualizing that with the literature, with sort of reports that are in the national context, and we will do national consultations to see the plausibility of these and what does it mean. And I think this is a really important part of driving the conversation and the process forward. But I might add here at the end of it also that while we talk about climate, it really is about environmentally driven aspects that we're looking at in terms of crop, water, sea level rise, and ecosystem productivity, all of which do relate back to livelihoods. Next slide, please. So what are the final takeaways? I think from the sort of even the data that we have that presented by Justin, we know that natural hazards are beginning to sort of shape and push some of this displacements. And we know from the fact that we are locked into climate that the potency of this will increase. And we know that likelihood that it would ramp up unless we take certain action. But I think the most important part is having some kind of a narrative that is grounded in data, grounded in analysis, and contextualized that can help us to inform that policy conversation so that we can move from a response-driven approach, which is critical to address the current crisis, but also to plan for the future context and to make sure that we bring in the right adaptation and development responses alongside with legal and policy context that is happening both nationally and globally. Thank you very much.
Kanta, thank you very much. That was great. And I also think this is cutting edge work you're doing. And it's very interesting to see how the Groundswell report is now moving also towards more granular and national based analysis. I think that will be extremely useful for policymaker and everyone as we go ahead. And I also picked up on your call for narrative grounded in data and science and context. I think that is what this field really need as we go forward. So that was great. Thank you so much. I also would like to remind everyone if there are questions for Kanta, you have the chat box to post those questions. Unless I'm mistaken, Susie and Afrin, I do not see any questions yet. So I also encourage you, before we let the last speaker come forward, that do you have questions for Justin or for Caroline or Kanta? Please post them in the chat box. We will have a round of question and discussion after the last speaker. So I invite everyone to put their questions. Thank you so much, Kanta. It's now my pleasure to introduce Luiza de Moura Pallone from the South American Network for Environmental Migration. Luiza, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. And I would like to thank you for the opportunity of joining today's seminar. And Afrin, if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the main discussions around the topic of environmental migration is the issue of generating evidence. In other words, to be able to measure how many people are moving in relation to changes in the environment. There are many initiatives attempting to gather existing data on disasters, for example, to provide an estimation of how many people have been displaced by disasters in a specific period. In the case of Brazil, most of these estimations are based on the data available in the official integrated disaster information system, which since 2012 has been the official channel for public authorities in states and municipalities to report the occurrence of a disaster and its impact on the area affected. So myself and my colleagues at Rizama, we decided to dig into this system to investigate how the data collection is structured and, most importantly, to what extent it is actually possible to identify displacement in this data. So today I would like to provide a brief background of how we ended up with this system in Brazil, what it looks like, to finally show you what are the gaps and opportunities for improvement that we identified in this process. So next slide, please. I think it's pretty safe to say that the years of 2011 and 2012 are a turning point in the timeline of disaster risk management in Brazil. Before 2012, although Brazil had some technical competency to monitor and foresee certain environmental phenomena, the country lacked a centralized institution to integrate activities and to invest in activities of prevention and mitigation. So most governmental measures, they were limited to the attenuation of losses and damages in the aftermath of a disaster. In 2011, January 2011, parts of Rio de Janeiro were hit by catastrophic landslides and flooding. More than 800 people died, more than 50,000 lost their homes. And the impact of this event made clear that post-disaster response was not enough and highlighted the need to strengthen disaster prevention and preparedness practices in the whole country. So in 2012, there were several improvements in the government's approach to disasters. I won't be able to go through all of them in this presentation, in this short presentation, but I can mention, for instance, the national policy on protection and civil defense, which became the national guideline for all the activities related to disaster risk management, and that was implemented in all the administrative levels. And I should also mention the creation of the Integrated Disaster Information System, which aimed at giving transparency and enabling the, let's say, the systematization of information reported around the whole country. Sorry, I forgot to ask to change the slide. So yeah, this is just an overview of some of the measures from 2012. If you could move another one, please. So as mentioned earlier, this system compiles official data reported by local authorities for the recognition of situations of emergency or state of public calamity, which is part of the process of transferring federal resources to states or municipalities affected by a disaster. So the system, it goes beyond the need to gather data, but it's also a mandatory step to obtain financial support. So in order to report the occurrence of a disaster, municipalities and state authorities must use a standardized disaster information form. If I could ask you to change the slide again, please. To compile all information, initial information about a disaster, which is then sent to the federal level for approval and then included in the disaster information system. So here you can see it is in Portuguese, but I think it's pretty nice to be able to see what these forms actually look like, because we talk a lot about these things, but we rarely see it in practice, right? So in this form, you can see that all human damage can be reported in 7 different categories. The categories of dislodged and unsheltered, and please bear in mind that this is our attempt to translate those terms that are very specific in Portuguese. These categories are defined according to the damage to people's houses and their need for temporary shelter in the aftermath of the disaster, which indicates the emergency character of those concepts. So although these two categories may in some cases overlap with situations of displacement, they don't encompass the whole displacement cycle and its implications in the long term. If you could change the slide again, please. So for instance, if someone is displaced as a consequence of a disaster, but housing is not affected, or not affected enough to generate the need for temporary shelter, they are generally not accounted for as dislodged or unsheltered, and therefore they would not be identified as a potentially displaced person. we could actually verify this. If you could change the slide once again. So this is an overview of disasters reported, natural disasters, quote unquote, officially reported in Brazil in 2019. And if you could change the slide again. When we look specifically at human damage related to droughts and prolonged droughts, most affected people in these contexts are reported under the category of other affected, which suggests a potential challenge in classifying the impacts of slow onset disasters in the categories of human damage provided by the disaster information form. So I would like to conclude by mentioning some of the main gaps and inconsistencies that we identified during this analysis. And if you could change the slide again, please. So in a nutshell, the legal framework in Brazil does not adopt the concept of displacement as of the present moment. As a consequence, the data collection system does not include a category that adequately captures a situation of displacement. Another issue, for example, is that the reports with the qualitative data, for instance, with the description of what are the other affected that we're talking about when these numbers are reported in the form, they are not made available in the same frequency as the quantitative data. Sometimes they are not made available at all, or it comes blank. And also the deadline to submit the forms, it varies from 15 to 20 days after the actual event, and there are no established monitoring procedures to update the information. So this clearly represents a big challenge to capture the impacts of slow onset disasters. And here it's very relevant to point out that the form that preceded the current disaster information form in Brazil, that was called Avadan, and I also included here in the next slide. If you could just change, yes, perfect, thank you. It did include some level of age disaggregation, and it included a category called displaced in the options under human damage. It was a category. So after the restructuring in 2012, although we saw great progress in terms of integrating, systematizing the data and making it available through the integrated system, it appears that there was a setback in terms of the categorization that does not anymore give visibility to people displaced. In the current form, the categories that remain are not adapted to the identification of people displaced by disasters, having consequences to the possibility of monitoring the evolution of disaster displacement in the country. Next slide, please. Next and last. But of course, we also see many opportunities for improvements in this in order to optimize this system that is already in place. And those would mainly be related to revising the legal framework to incorporate provisions related to displacement, incorporate appropriate terms and categories that reflect situations of displacement into the data collection forms. But of course, this cannot come just on the paper. It cannot just be on the form as a new category, but it also requires capacity building efforts with local authorities regarding the methodology, what each category means, what's the criteria, the concepts in order to improve the data accuracy, and the development of methodologies that consider different timescales and the impacts of slow onset hazards as well, which would include investing in some monitoring capacity. So I'll have to conclude here, also highlighting that this study aimed at laying the ground for further investigation. It was first published as a background paper to IDMC's Grid 2020. I will share the link here on the chat if you would like to read more. And Brazama will continue developing on this research for further contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luiza. That was great. And sorry for indicating the time time limitation. I think that was great example, very detailed from a country, Brazil. So I think that's very interesting and very useful how to develop that. One question that you may want to ponder, which I was asking myself, is how does it look like more at the South American scene? Do you do research in other countries? So how does Brazil compare to other countries and their capacity? But that's maybe something you may want to answer when we go into the question rounds. So this brings this panel to a close. And we have had a few questions already been posted in the chat box. And maybe just to get started, and for me also to get a sense of what's there. Justin, you had a question directly from Paula Sisongna from the University of Buenos Aires, and it was about how IDMC collect information when countries doesn't have an internal displacement population database on hazard cases. So maybe before we systematize some of the questions that we have had, maybe you want to go first, Justin, on that, and let's evaluate that one first.
Sure, thanks very much, Atle, and thanks for the great question, Paula. I'll try to answer this in a fairly general way because it applies not just to Argentina. So the vast majority of countries do not maintain databases of disaster displacement or internal displacement of any form, actually. There are a few notable exceptions, but most don't. And most beyond that, making things even more difficult, is that something that Atle mentioned at the top of the webinar is that from one country to another, from one region to another, there are different definitions and standards. This is something that Luiza was just talking about in the Brazil context. So producing a harmonized data set for a given country, for a region, and for the entire world is a massive challenge. And that's what IDMC spends quite a lot of time working on throughout the year, led by Sylvain Poncer, who's actually on the line with us today. So the way that this is done in the Argentina context, as is seen in the link I just shared a few minutes ago, is by triangulating data from multiple sources. So there was some data published by IFRC, as you might guess, specifically related to things like evacuation and the emergency phase of a disaster. But this is also then triangulated with additional kinds of information around housing damage and destruction and things of that nature, so that we don't end up having to rely on one source or one type of data to answer a question about how is disaster displacement evolving over the course of a given event over time. And this applies, like I said, to pretty much every country in the world, because when you think about trying to basically monitor the magnitude and the number of people displaced by a disaster over the course of any event, there's almost no one organization that's collecting data in that particular manner that enables you to answer this question. You usually have to piece together information, be it from IOM or UNHCR or OCHA, with other kinds of information from a government or housing damage and destruction, or even using alternative sources of non-traditional data like mobile phone call, user call detail records, or Facebook user location data, things like this. So again, that applies for Argentina, but for almost every other country, including the question that was there from Turkey as well. And then if anyone has questions beyond that, happy to follow up with you later bilaterally or offline. Over.
Thank you, Justin, that you picked up on the question on Turkey also. I have now some general questions to the panel, so maybe we can go through some of these questions. So one is, good afternoon from Berlin, from Julia Blocher, and she has a question from anyone in the panel, but maybe it's most appropriate for Justin. You spoke about the complexity of linking displacement to slow onset hazard triggers, and I wonder if there are any innovation in linking disaster-related displacement to conflict displacement and vice versa you could speak to. So maybe take that in, Justin, and then we can do a round with the others. We also have a question from Alex de Sherbenin to Luiza. Have you seen that, Luiza? Could you nod if you see it? So So I can also repeat it from Alex de Sherbenin and also about the definitional issue. So that one will come your way, Luiza. So thanks a lot for being prepared for that one. We also have a question from Andrea Pacheco. Kanta, lovely talk. He asked about whether there's any reason for not having included drought and desertification in the modification.
We don't hear Atle, right, David?
Hi, everyone. I think Atle must have briefly dropped off, so I'm going to step into his moderator's shoes, if that's all right. You will have seen that there's quite a number of questions coming up in the chat box. Some of them are on definitional issues and others are more punctual in relation to the data that you've presented. So if I could go in order. Justine, you've already had an intervention. We'll come back to you after the others, if that's okay. So Caroline, could I go over to you next, please? And then followed by Kanta, Luiza, and Justine.
Hi, so scanning through the chat box, I think that I'll take one of the more general questions, which was, I believe from you, David, about the implications for policy and the key data gaps that would speak to policy. So I already started, I think, touching on this in my intervention, but I think that there are a couple key gaps that really have big implications for policy. And again, not just because policy responds to things, but also because policy feeds back into these systems, right? Policy shapes when people can go, whether that's through stringent migration policies, whether that's through adaptation interventions. But if we see this as a system, you see policy as part of a system, not as a response to a system where it doesn't have any impact on what happens. Of course it does. So one of the things that I would say is, again, focusing on perceptions, linking to these social tipping points, because if you're preparing for migration based on a physical or climatic tipping point and saying, well, when this happens, then we're going to react and we're going to prepare for this climatic tipping point, you're not maybe prepared for then these social tipping points being reached beforehand. So you might have migration, but you're not ready for it because you're waiting for 2050 when the tick, tick, boom climate happens, apparently. So I think that's one thing, is coming from the perceptions angle, not just, a lot of times we say, oh, isn't it funny that migrants don't identify as climate migrants and they don't know any better that they're actually climate migrants. And I think that that's really the wrong way around, because you're also then reifying that idea for policymakers that we know better than the people who are actually experiencing things. And so that's why for us, using something like fuzzy cognitive mapping, where we work to use data methods to find how people make those links between climate and economics and politics and social and what they see as causality, rather than this top-down external approach. That's how we're actually going to understand when migration happens or when it doesn't happen, or when people are at greater risk for displacement because maybe they're not making those links, and maybe that climate tipping point will be reached before the social tipping point. So I think those are things that are really going to help policy be more responsive to actually what's being happened, and more responsive to this kind of human based or people-centered approach to this nexus, and again, more, I think, again, evidence-based policies has been mentioned.
Excellent. Many thanks, Caroline, for starting off with one of the big questions, which is always nice to start off with. I know that there are a number of other big questions and smaller ones there in the chat. If I can go next to Kanta, would you like to take your pick of the questions and respond to some of those, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. Let me touch first on a specific question, and then I want to come back to a more general point. I think there was a question from on drought and whether we in the Groundswell model looked at the issue of drought. We did in a way, because we looked at water stress and sort of prolonged water stress, which really then captures the aspect related to drought. So I think that's in terms of the model. We also have, in the recent enhancements, brought in within the modeling the conflict data sets in the sense that we put that in as one of the factors after it's not modeled, but it's a layer of information where areas of conflict, obviously in the context of the gravity model, tend not to be the ones that attract people, less so in urban areas than rural areas, and we can talk about that. But I also want to step back a little bit. I think, on sort of why we need this kind of data and evidence-based approach to understand what is happening now, and why we also need to understand what is going to possibly unfold. And this really goes back a little bit, I mean, to the whole notion when we talk about social, it's also talking about people, and it's talking about poverty, it's talking about development. We know that the poor are disproportionately impacted. We know that they are probably the most entrapped and can't move. And then there are others who move from distress to higher risk. And I think the idea here is, how can we bring this information to interface with policymakers so that they begin to put in place two kinds of strategies. One is how we respond to the crisis right now, but how we begin to have more proactive and anticipatory strategies that bring the issue of migration into the larger planning processes and the policy processes. And I think the legal side of migration is extremely important on the protection side, which sometimes the internally displaced are not covered for. But I just like to sort of think that we are looking at it in a multi-causal way. We have to look at it from the continuum of why people are moving, but it's really about, to some extent, their needs and their welfare. But let me stop there, David. I just wanted to make that comment.
That's a very helpful intervention. And thanks, Kanta, for addressing not only the punctual question, the specific question to you, but also some of those bigger issues as well. Luiza, would you like to come in on some of the questions that have been posed?
Yes, sure. I guess I'll comment on the question raised by Alex. I think when we're talking about the categories, is definitely a very sensitive issue. Of course, we are not supposed to get stuck on the discussion of categories and then not move forward, of course, but it is a very important step. And when you're talking about the category of homeless, this, for instance, in the Brazilian case, it's a very it generates some misunderstanding. When you translate the categories that are used, in the 7 categories that I mentioned, if you try to translate that, it might give homeless as one of the possible translations. But in Brazil, that is a very specific issue that encompasses a lot of other realities, and is not necessarily what is the context of that they are trying to represent on that specific data set, on that specific report. So that's why we try to come up with different translations that are not homeless, to not overlap. But it is an issue, especially, and that's what we try to highlight with the whole slow onset events, because if you are looking at the household numbers and the households that were affected, if it's a drought, for example, that's not going to give you an accurate estimation or an accurate prediction if we are basing ourselves on the damage to the housing, for example, or if the person was needed temporary shelter and as such. So I think that's why we highlight a change in the methodology to encompass also the different timelines and the different dynamics of the various events.
Great, many thanks, Luiza. And thanks also for the question from Alex, which usefully trailed that big picture question about, we may be counting, but before we start counting, we have to know what it is we're counting, the kind of definitional and conceptual issues or challenges sometimes that underlie that. So really nice to have that input from you, Luiza, on the point. Justin, can I come back to you? I know that there are a couple of extra questions that have popped up in the chat box, some of them aimed at you, and you're also, again, very welcome to come in on some of the bigger issues, if you like, the cross-cutting issues that have been raised in the chat box and by your fellow panelists. So Justin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Yeah, I'll try to touch on them all. So first, to Julia Blocher's question from Berlin about innovations on linking disaster and conflict-related displacement. I think in a way, this actually goes to one of Caroline's points from a little while ago, which is about really taking a human-centric approach to understanding mobility. And I think what this kind of gets at as well is this tension between anyone who's trying to really understand this and to project risk or model future displacement risk at scale, is how to accommodate the complexity of how this manifests in a particular space and time, with at the same time a competing demand for global projections or even regional projections. It's really difficult to marry these competing agendas or competing questions, but that is one of the very exciting things about the Habitable project, is that it represents an approach to doing just that. There are different ways of doing this, of course, that do allow one to combine a kind of a top-down modeling approach with kind of a more granular, nuanced, multi-causal, fuzzy logic style understanding of human motivation and risk perceptions, et cetera, using, again, non-traditional sources of data, as well as survey data, and supercomputers, which is now required to kind of crunch the volume of data needed to do this. To answer Nikki's question, hello Nikki, about the use of emergency applications and emergency data. There's one good example of how this was done recently. I think it was in July or August, where OCHA and IFRC in Bangladesh modeled flood levels associated with forecast rainfall, and then used that to trigger a payout from the UN's SURF to respond to the flooding and flood-related displacement and flood-affected communities in a more timely and targeted manner than it had otherwise been the case. So that's one example off the top of my head. Emily asked a question about people who are displaced from one location to another high-risk location. This is something that happens, I think, all too often and is not as well documented as we would like it to be. I personally witnessed this doing field research in the southern Philippines, where I saw people who were displaced by floods being relocated, quote unquote, permanently onto very unstable landslide-prone hillsides. But you hear about the same thing happening, but mostly in a more anecdotal manner when people are displaced, particularly within or to urban and peri-urban areas, often into informal settlements, which are often located almost by definition in hazard-prone areas. Kearney asked a question about longitudinal studies, particularly I think related to Dorian. I think she'll be lucky to know that John Marazita, who's on this webinar with us, actually has done field research on Dorian in the Caribbean. So I think I would encourage her to follow up with him. He did a background paper for IDMC's, or a paper for IDMC last year. And I think there is more longitudinal studies that are needed. I mean, there can never be enough, in fact. I mean, I think this is, like it or not, a still emerging field, as it were. And I think knowing in advance how to apply this information for whether it's climate change adaptation planning or disaster risk reduction planning in advance of doing the research, kind of really properly framing the questions is a critical component of it. And then lastly, just to respond to your kind of more general question, David, I do want to come back to something that both Caroline and Kanta touched on too, about how this is going to unfold and what are we really up to here. I think in Kanta's intervention just a moment ago, she underscored, or at least touched on the forward-looking nature of this. And I think that is the name of the game. It's not just about knowing how many people were displaced or have migrated, but it's what's the risk of future displacement and migration? What are those scenarios? And then I think it's not just about how do you furnish this information so that policymakers can take the right decisions or evidence-informed decisions. But it's also about finding ways to bring this information and to bring these scenarios right back to the people who are implicated, to the people who are at risk of becoming displaced or having to migrate in the future. There is no way to eliminate displacement risk or the likelihood that people may migrate in the future due to some of the things that we've been talking about this afternoon. So that's just a mathematical or logical impossibility. So then it's about bringing the information to those people so that they can take informed decisions for themselves, because I think relying on just top-down decision-making and policy-making alone isn't going to be sufficient. I mean, I think it's about that conversation between policymakers and governments with at-risk communities. Over. Thanks very much.
Atle, are you back? Yes. I don't think we can hear you. Do you want to, is your mic on? Possibly not. Okay, I was going to suggest that after quite a rich round of interventions, which touched on a number of the questions which had been raised, that we just have one last...
David, I'm sorry.
You're here. You're
Yes.
here, okay. Over to you in that case, Atle, if you want to tie things up.
Yes, thank you so much, David. I'm awfully sorry. That was the second time my computer froze today. I should have taken that as a signal. I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists. I just want to let you have an opportunity for a last round, maybe 1 minute from each one of you. If that's of interest, it's optional, but maybe we can go backwards. So we start with Luiza and then Kanta, Caroline, and Justin. In case you want to say something just before we wrap up, maybe a big ask from your side, something around how are we doing, what could really make your work easier and better. So Luiza, if you want to say a few words before we wrap up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Kind of froze from my side. No, I think it was a very interesting discussion. I don't have anything specific to add, but thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here. It's always nice to share ideas and to see how everybody's working with data and with knowledge in this topic. And we can always learn from each other and collaborate to share our findings and work better every time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luiza. Kanta, final words from you.
Thank you, Atle. And maybe just a couple of reflections. But the first, I think, is really ultimately, I think the conversation is about the most vulnerable on the ground, right? Who are really being impacted by climate and who are obviously forced into sort of distress-driven mobility patterns. Never can have a causality just to climate, but obviously it's a composite of factors being exacerbated by climate. And I think how we address this in the context of those communities is extremely important. And I think that's where I'd like to think that, we need to come together as actors and players. And I think what I'm really heartened by in the last few years is really the work that the humanitarian community and UNHCR and IOM and the World Bank are really coming together to conceive more progressive ways of looking at this issue from an end to end, so that we really have those kind of durable solutions that are not siloed within our own groups and not really serving the purpose of those communities who are most impacted. And then the second is for us to also collectively be prepared for what is unfolding. Unfortunately, I think we're stuck into a certain amount of this kind of distress-driven migration, and how we bring together the top-down, bottom-up approaches, as well as different kinds of data sets, right? Whether it's case studies, whether it's systems approach, whether it's modeling, but to really ultimately use that to understand the context better so that we can both address these communities' needs in the present, but really plan and prepare for a future that I think if we don't act and plan early enough, we will be in a continued state of crisis. So I think these conversations and learning and sharing are extremely important. And I'm always heartened to see new ideas and new ways of looking at this and to build the bridges amongst ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanta. That was encouraging to hear that we are progressing. That's always good to hear. So Caroline, a few final words from you.
Yes, I mean, final words sounds so grim, but I think I want to echo what's already being said. And I think that when we talk about data knowledge specifically on disaster displacement or mobility more generally, there is no silver bullet, right? There's no silver bullet policy solution. There's also no silver bullet data solution. So that's why it's great to have people looking at all different angles. And I think that's reflected in this discussion, all of the different questions that we can look at, all of the different data methods we can use, modeling at the global level, at the regional level, at the local level, qualitative methods, all of that. It's a bit like climate change itself as well. There is no one thing we need to do. We need to find the right combination of methods and approaches and different organizations working together to make sure that we have that picture at least better or more clear than it is now. And so I think, we have to keep, bridging these, different organizations, different actors, academic, international organizations, development groups, etc., but using all of those tools to the best whole picture that we can.
Thank you. Super. Justin.
Thanks. I'll be super brief because I think you've all heard quite enough from me. I think I just want to kind of pick up on Caroline's last point there, because I think it's a good one. I mean, I think, the knowledge and the data will always continue to improve as this field grows and matures. But we can't let this get in the way of taking actions and acting when we can, and at least having the conversations when we can. Because I think often enough the data is good enough, but then the good decisions don't get made. I'm from the US originally, and the data and the information on the risks of disaster displacement there have been available for decades, but they haven't been acted on in the most kind of evidence-based policy making, just not to pick on the US, but just to give one example of this. So I think we can't let the lack of perfect data or perfect models get in the way of having the conversations about what we actually what are the scenarios that we would like to envisage for ourselves as communities from taking place. Thanks very much. And really just a thanks to the fellow panelists for really great presentations. I learned a lot from you all today.
Thank you. And ending on that note, I also would like to thank all of you. I think we are in good hands. People like you doing data knowledge, I think we are in good hands, and we will really progress if with this capacity. I also want to thank my colleagues at RLI and PDD for this event, and really the pleasure we have had to have this event very much building on the first one we had in October. And I also would like to thank all the participants for great questions. There's a very strong community out there that we can work on. With that, I also would like to remind everyone that we have a third webinar session coming up on 9th of December. And that's about global policy debates, mobility and natural hazards. So that's also a relevant discussion from what we have had today. There is quite a lot happening now around data knowledge and attempts to strengthen coordination, but also to strengthen the work going forward. PDD, we have something called a data knowledge working group, and on the 24th of November, we will have a market session. So I invite everyone to check our website if they would be interested to attend or join that. And also to remind everyone that Internal Displacement Monitoring Center are also establishing a series of dialogues and expert forum on disaster displacement data and internal displacement data. And they have the first dialogue on the 8th of December. So you may want to check out the website of IDMC. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for their attention and for their input and participation. From the organizers, thank you so much, and I wish you all a nice morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you so much.